For decades, leadership hinged on intelligence, hard work, your expertise, your alma mater. And now AI has really collapsed that moat. The information gap has now flattened. Knowledge is no longer that differentiator. So judgment, presence, the ability to read a room, the ability to know when to pause, when to take a step back, those are all the skills that we need now more than ever before.
You're listening to How to Make a Leader, a leadership development podcast from Big Think Plus, where we take the best ideas from the biggest minds in learning and development and distill them into actionable insights. I'm your host, Hannah Beaver. Emotional intelligence has always been at the heart of great leadership, but we haven't always built for it intentionally. My guest today has spent her career doing just that, and the AI era has only made her work more urgent. Panjwani is an industrial organizational psychologist by training and an operator by practice. She's built leadership and performance systems inside Twilio, VMware, and OneTrust, and most recently at Procore, where she led talent development. She now runs Work Happy, where she does the same thing for scaling companies. Today, we'll get into what an EQ-based leadership system looks like in practice, the behaviors, the accountability structures, and importantly, how you develop leaders differently at every level. Ash, welcome to the How to Make a Leader podcast.
Hi, Hannah. Thanks for having me.
Of course. So from all my research prior to this episode, I was actually fascinated to find out that you have pretty much always been interested in the intersection of psychology and leadership development. So can you bring us back? What drew you into this space initially?
Yeah, I think I'm one of those rare breeds that just knew very, very early on that this was my calling. I actually remember being like 10 or 12 years old. I mean, my dad was a small business owner. He still is. My mom, a marketing executive. And, you know, you'd like meet at the dinner table and do a recap of your day. How did school go? How was work? And over time, I started to realize they weren't talking about the operational challenges. They weren't talking about the technical challenges of their work. They're not talking about finances sometimes, but not like consistently. They're not talking about accounting. They're like not talking about the mechanics of running the teams or the business. It always came down to the people. It came down to the conversations that they had, the challenging conversations that they had, the misinterpretations, the miscommunications, the like, I shouldn't have said that. And I could see that this person didn't like what I just said to them. You know, like I started to pick up on these nuances. It was always the human stuff. And then one day I was in like a high school psychology course and the professor goes off talking about this practice of IO psychology. And I think in that moment, I kind of knew that this was what I wanted to do. I wanted to study workplace behavior, and I've kind of been chasing it ever since.
I'd love like a young desire to go into like a corporate career and that you can look back and say that you're doing that today, which I think is, like you said, very unique.
Yeah, and it was actually really great because my parents, because they were just like so business minded, I knew that business is what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
But I also loved the human element. And like, it's one of those things like growing up, everyone always said, you have really great emotional intelligence. I'm like, what do I do with that? Like, I don't know if I can make a career out of that until that one moment. And it all kind of made sense.
And then kind of weaving that thread, how has that shown up in your career to this day and what you're doing now?
Yeah, I mean, like the last decade plus has really been in tech companies. But prior to that, I was actually a consultant and I was working at this really sweet boutique consulting firm working with companies up and down the Silicon Valley and working with the CEO directly. And that was such an amazing experience. But it was always looking from the outside in. And I really wanted to go all in. I wanted to see what it actually looks like to watch the interactions between two people. What happens when we design something and it lands or doesn't land? What's the impact in an organization? Like I wanted to see it all the way through. So I started my tech career at VMware and talk about like mature talent infrastructure and a mature talent organization. They have the ability to absorb all these really robust systems that we're handing to them, which was an amazing stepping stone because immediately I knew what great looked like. And then I transitioned to Twilio, which taught me just so much. It was all about speed. It was quality while still keeping up the pace, building some really rich programs while keeping up the pace. And we weren't delivering in quarters and years anymore. This was all down to months and weeks. And that was an incredible experience. And then OneTrust came, and I really learned like the value and the importance of building infrastructure, performance infrastructure, leadership infrastructure. And then when Procore came, it was the magic of building from scratch. And I say that kind of tongue in cheek because I don't think you're ever, especially in our world, I don't think you're ever really building from scratch unless you are like N of one, right? There's always some history that came before you. So Procore was a really fun challenge because it was building something new while still honoring the past. And, through those experiences, company over company, I came to realize there's a pattern. There's a way to do this, and there's a way to do this well, which is what landed me at my current thing, which is WorkHappy. I build performance and leadership infrastructure for scaling companies and love what I do.
Let's look back at your time most recently at one of those companies, which was at Procore. So using that as an example, in developing leaders there, you started by asking a big foundational question. What was it?
Yeah, I love this question. For those listening, like if you're in talent development, you get these requests all day, every day. We need to develop our people. We need to develop our leaders. The people are hungry for activity and programs. They need to feel like they're invested in. But that's just it. It's activity, it's programs. It feels productive, but it's really not, right? It's likely not going to lead to that behavior change. And I think that's kind of the nuance that I was starting to pick up. So instead of programs, imagine if you're like walking into a performance calibration and you actually know how to assess the talent that's in front of you, especially leaders. You know how to assess what good leaders look like, what great looks like, what are things that we won't tolerate. And so that's the feeling that I kept chasing. And so going back to your question about the 3 questions or so that I started asking, it was really, what are the behaviors? What do we expect from leaders in this company? And inevitably it does lead to a competency model. I think a lot of us have seen that now. I think the more important question then becomes, why do these behaviors matter to this particular business? And then land with, how will we actually know when we see these behaviors in practice, in motion across the organization? I think a lot of companies, like I said, they end up establishing that competency model, but then to actually weave it into the full communication and describing the why, building that conviction from leaders around why this is so important is so critical. And then the how, this is how you bring those behaviors to life. Otherwise, it's just a beautiful set of behaviors written in a deck or written in an intranet somewhere, but you don't really see them in like the fabric of the company in which you're operating.
And can you walk me through some of the core leadership expectations you landed on? So talking about kind of as you're defining the why, the how, where did you start there?
Yeah. At Procore, it was psychological safety. It was setting clear direction, so this alignment element. It was feedback, so a lot of this accountability and coaching. And like in broad buckets, right? Like this is what I would distill it down to. The word choice was very different on the inside. But this is what I'll say. The behaviors just vary so much. So yes, these are like the 4 buckets that we landed on, but it could look so wildly different depending on the company that you're operating in. So for those listening, I would actually encourage you, if you're looking to build this set of behaviors and principles out for your organization, I would start with just listening. Interview leaders at all levels. I'm talking the senior most, the middle, the front line, the junior managers. Ask them questions like, what do we need out of our leaders today? At this company, in this time and space, at this stage, what do we need them to do extremely well? And what do we need them to do extremely well maybe a year down the road, maybe 2 years down the road? What does good look like? What does great look like? What are some standout behaviors? Like what is that one leader that does this XYZ look like? And could you quote them? Could you think about that one moment that they really stood out? And then also describe like the dark side of leadership. And the answers might not surprise you. It's probably things that you've probably picked up along the way, but the word choice might. And the word choice is actually what's going to help make it stick in the organization. So my goal is always like the HR police shouldn't be the author. Like we should be the ghostwriter in all of this. You should never know it was me behind all those words. It should feel like the organization really came together to co-architect, to co-author these words and put them publicly facing.
I love that you mentioned making sure that you're talking to everyone at every level and those kind of interviews and conversations. That's something that we've heard on multiple podcast interviews about how people went about defining, their leadership system. So it's great to hear that point reinforced. And I think as we anchor this conversation as well around emotional intelligence and those EQ skills, I do think what strikes me about, for example, those 4 leadership expectations that you just shared, those are in essence, they require you to read people, regulate yourself, respond to what's happening in the room. Those are all EQ-based skills. So as we think about leaders at different levels, why keep the foundational skills the same across every level rather than building out separate models?
The shared vernacular is so important. When managers aren't speaking in the same language from manager to director to VP, things start to break. And once it's different, like imagine leaders having to learn a new language every time they get promoted. They were speaking in English, then they have to learn French, and then once they graduate to the senior most, now you're learning Spanish, right? Like it just creates so much burden on them to onboard each time they're getting promoted into a new role. It's hard enough. And then to add this layer on, like your expectations are changing, not just from a technical standpoint, but also from like a behavioral standpoint. And so for that reason, I like to actually keep things pretty consistent so that it's shared language throughout and they're just getting in the reps every single time they're going through the promotions and sticking with the organization. And really, like when you have a shared foundation, which is so critical, the reality though, and I'm sure others are wondering the same, like the reality is the roles are very different, right? Like your manager experience is very different from your director, very different from your VP. So yes, the behaviors and the competencies are the same, but then how you develop these individuals should be evolved, should be a little bit more different. And so that's why like I take a very unique approach to how I like to develop the 3 groups. With frontline managers, I mean, they're usually first-time leaders. They're in the throes of trying to figure it all out. They just want to learn how to nail the basics. And so the most important thing that I think I can give to them is giving them a peer network, a cohort, where they can really learn from like-minded individuals, those who are in a similar stage, who are managing a similar level of context, similar level of complexity. They're maybe managing like the same kind of like organizational challenges, that maybe like the same kind of business outcome challenges. They have a group to lean on. I think there's also added benefit, which you don't see in the moment, but you do see as they continue to get promoted, later on, is they're building cross-functional relationships, right? Like these are, this is going to be a really critical skill as they grow into that director level role, into that VP level role, because those expectations of role is also going to change. So I do lean heavily on cohort-based for that people manager cohort. And I'm not saying that frameworks aren't important. I think it helps set up the conversation, but really 60 to 70% of the time is like facilitated dialogue, conversations, and really practice in rooms. For that director population are like lonely middle. Their VPs are so busy setting organizational strategy and their managers need them in the weeds. And they're often caught and doing both. Like they're executing and continuing to set direction. It's a really hard place to be. And frankly, like time is not on their side. As much as they would probably benefit from a cohort, benefit from frameworks, and you should, I'm not saying you shouldn't. I think like the most value add thing that you could do for them is actually giving them a coach. Someone who's going to be a mirror for them in every single situation, work through some really hard challenges, ask them the hard questions so that they can come up with it themselves. I think that's a real unlock. And then my VP layer, they're the most unique, right? Like they've been around, they've kind of nailed the basics. They've seen every framework out there, I'm sure, right? And they've been tasked to solve the gnarliest organizational challenges. In my experience, they usually have a visceral reaction to anything that feels formal and development heavy. So my whole thing with them is I would love to, and I put them in a room with their peers where they can really hash it out. Where can they get time with that one person that they're usually on a Zoom call with who sits on the other side of the world? They need more than that 30 minutes to crack like the hairiest problem in the organization. Let's give them that. Let's create the conditions, the environment for them to really sit in that disagreement, sit in that pause, sit in that discomfort, and then come out on the other side with clarity. And that's not to say that's not development. I actually like to call this like hiding medicine in the ice cream. they don't know that they're being stretched. They don't know that they're developing and they're growing and they're learning. They're just doing it through work. And I think that's actually the way that you earn the most trust as an HR leader, and then they get the most out of the time spent.
So taking a step back as we think about the systems that have been created, how did you know that a system was really working?
When you think about, in my mind, there's 3 layers of the system, right? Like you set the standard, you have the behaviors, the shared behaviors that you've already described. You have the accountability layer through the building approach. You've embedded those behaviors in every single talent practice. That's very, very important and critical to your business. And then once you know what the baseline was and where they are based on the established set of behaviors, then you can go ahead and bridge the capability gap. And when you have that clear story to tell, like the capability aspect, the numbers that we end up displaying are just so much more meaningful. We built this foundational manager development program at Procore, grounded in our set of behaviors. We saw 95% completion in the first year, from bottom all the way to the top. 95% speaking the same language, learning the same things, sharing the same behaviors, nailing the basics together. It definitely a highlight of my career. And then for the directors who received coaching, we saw a significant change in their performance. I'm talking like a meaningful change in where they are in the rating system in a positive way. That tells me things are working. And then beyond that, you start to see engagement going up. You start to see that like trust and leadership number also evolving. Those are all great signs that something's working.
And also such a great way to take back that hard statistic. Obviously, it's a bigger picture, but being able to take that 95% statistic back is always just going to continue that life cycle of support for these programs. I want to shift the conversation now to AI and emotional intelligence and how that is impacting how it's showing up in our leadership systems. So I've read in a prior publication that AI didn't change the need for EQ, it exposed the lack of it. What do you mean by that?
For decades, leadership hinged on intelligence, hard work, your expertise, your alma mater. Promotions were even given to those who had the fastest answers, who had the greatest strategies. And now AI has really collapsed that moat, right? Like the junior analyst can actually run a really strong prompt and get the same output as the most seasoned senior person on the team who may have had decades of experience. Now there's nuance in that, but from a technical standpoint, they can probably keep up. The information gap has now flattened. And which is why I say answers are cheap, right? It's now everything else that's so important. Knowledge is no longer that differentiator. So judgment, presence, the ability to read a room, the ability to like push in the right times, to the ability to know when to pause, when to take a step back. Those are all the skills that we need now more than ever before. And you know, on the other side of this era will reward those who lead with curiosity, who lead with emotional intelligence, who know the weight that they carry when they enter a room. And what I keep coming back to is like when you peel the onion on emotional intelligence, that's really like the makeup of a good leader. That's where I land over and over again. In my mind, leaders who are grounded in emotional intelligence end up cultivating greater trust with their teams. Trust then, though indirectly, but can lead to greater engagement across organizations. What's so saying like 70% of someone's engagement is directly related to their manager experience. And that engagement then leads to greater performance. And that performance then can lead to 23% higher profitability. I mean, I think Gallup research can actually back this up. So for me, it really does all hinge on emotional intelligence.
I think it shows too that intelligence doesn't develop by accident. We have to ingrain it into these systems. So now I want to hear about how you make it stick. So to use Procore as an example, given you shared that fabulous statistic, so we know it stuck, we know it worked. You put a lot of energy into onboarding as a lever there. So why do you think that day one experience is so important?
And so underleveraged, right? I mean, like day one is typically the only time a new leader is craving new information. They want to know, how does this place work? What do I need to know about operating in this place? Can someone point out the potholes for me? And after that, they're no longer seeking answers. They're just in the throes of it and they will just have to figure it out. And I always say, if you don't define it, Someone else will define it for you, which means if you don't explicitly tell them what good leadership looks like here, they'll either pick it up from a company that they worked with previously, a model that they've previously used, or they'll create a new model based on just their mere observations of how the place is running. That's why I put so much weight in onboarding, especially leader onboarding, because it can be so, so critical.
As it relates to those leaders, how do you keep them accountable to the behaviors once the program is done? I'm curious what that looks like in practice.
Yeah, and I don't think the program is ever done, right? Like you drive accountability by hardwiring these behaviors into every decision that already exists inside of an organization. I'm thinking your hiring criteria, your promotion criteria, your performance reviews, your manager feedback, your top-down feedback, your bottoms-up feedback. Like everything should be grounded in those behaviors. And that's how you get it beyond just words on a wall, but really move it into the fabric, move it into the DNA of the organization. It gives you a really good pulse on what's working and what's not, right? And then your programming can evolve based on those data and facts. And so then the behaviors don't just end up living in a deck. You actually see it around you. You see what was rewarded, what was not rewarded. This person got a promotion because they showed up with these behaviors, not because of the lack of it.
I'd like to hit you with some reflective questions now. So what would you do differently if you were building a leadership development system from scratch today, whether a system is ever truly from scratch, as you mentioned before?
The newest lesson, I guess, in my toolbox has been it's really easy to join a team and get distracted by a budget conversation. I call it the budget trap. You think about the dollars for the program, the headcount that you need, the support that you need. It feels like a productive conversation, but it's actually kind of premature, which is why you see those like glanced eyes. If I was building this from scratch today, I wouldn't even engage in a budget conversation. I would actually go and sit with business. I would talk to the leaders. I would talk to the employees. What do we need a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now? Once I have a strong pulse on where we are in the systems build, whether that's leadership, whether that's performance, whether that's any of the talent practices, really, then you can go back and have a budget conversation, and it feels like you're coming from a place of data and facts and not just like rainbows and butterflies, which it can sometimes feel like.
And then from a practical sense, if you're starting at zero, what's the first move?
Yeah, I'll pull the red thread on this one. Start listening from day one. That's the goal for the first 60 days in role. Talk to the leaders at every level, the senior, the middle, the junior. Talk to the employees who are experiencing these leaders day in, day out. And I'm not just talking about survey data. I think like we can get inundated with so much great data that's out there, engagement data, exit data, all of that great stuff. And not saying you shouldn't look at it, but the magic really does sit in anecdotal feedback. I want to hear how someone describes the best leader they've ever had in this company. I want someone to describe like who is someone or like what were the behaviors of this person who didn't show up as their best self. Who was that one person that you're still thinking about? What is that one word, one sentence, one phrase that they said to you that still sticks with you? That's really what I'm listening for. So my advice is just take the time to listen.
I really like that. And that leads very nicely to my next question. What is the best piece of leadership advice that you have ever received?
People have been very kind and giving, and they've given me a lot of advice and feedback over my career. As a talent development leader, I think the best one was to stop sitting in a vacuum and go sit with a business. And I will be forever grateful for those who opened up the door and pulled up a chair for me to serve as an HR business partner. That was the most enlightening experience of my career. I realized I had been building solutions and programs for things that no one really asked for. I think I was so removed and aloof from the actual problems that people were facing day in, day out. And this HR business partner experience really gave me the other side of the perspective. What do people actually need? How are they actually experiencing the stuff that's happening in like the center of excellence and the people-related world? Is it actually moving the needle? And now that's actually changed the way that I operate. So if you've worked with me or you've been on my team, you know that I will repeatedly ask, in service of what? Why are we building that development program? What's the need? In service of what? Are we trying to help sales close deals faster? Are we trying to increase time to productivity? Do we have high attrition? Are we having new managers that aren't having the best onboarding experience? Like, what is the problem that we're solving for before we go into the work? And honestly, like sitting with that for as long as I have, that's what led me to Work Happy. That's exactly what I'm trying to build here.
Thanks so much for listening. For more from Ash, I've added her LinkedIn and her company Work Happy into the show notes so you can check out more. For more from the podcast, make sure you subscribe so you never miss an episode. We'll be back next month and every month with another insight from another L&D leader. Thanks for listening.